The following story is true. The names have been changed at the request of the survivors. After all, this is a horror fiction podcast. PseudoPod, episode 677, November 29th, 2019. This week's story, When a Beast Looks Up at the Stars, by Oren Gray. Hi everyone, welcome to PseudoPod, the weekly horror podcast. I'm Alistair, your host, and this week's story comes to us from the mighty Oren Gray, and first saw print in Oren's third collection, Guignol and Other Sardonic Tales. Oren is a writer, editor, amateur film scholar, and monster expert who was born on the night before Halloween. His stories of monsters, ghosts, and sometimes the ghosts of monsters have appeared in dozens of anthologies, including Ellen Datlow's Best Horror of the Year, and he's the author of the collections Never Bet the Devil and Other Warnings, and Painted Monsters and Other Strange Beasts, not to mention various licensed work and a series of essays on vintage horror cinema, Monsters from the Vault Volumes 1 and 2. I am reacting in real time here. I had no idea that those two books existed, and now they must be mine. Oh yes. They must be mine. Updates for his writing happen regularly on his website at Who Killed Oren Gray. Your narrator for this story is the equally magnificent John Paget. John is a professional, though lapsed ventriloquist who lives in New Orleans with his spouse, their daughter, and a rescue dog and cat. He is the editor-in-chief of Vastarian, a literary journal, a source of critical study and creative response to the work of Thomas Ligotti, as well as associated authors and ideas. Paget's first short story collection, The Secret of Ventriloquism, was named the best fiction book of 2016 by Rue Morgue, and deserved it absolutely. He has work out or forthcoming in Weird Fiction Review, PseudoPod, oh hey, I know those guys, Lovecraft Ezine, Xenoibis, and the anthologies A Walk on the Weird Side, Wound of Wounds, Phantasm Chimera, For Mortal Things Unsung, I know them too, and Ashes and Entropy. So, without further ado, these gentlemen have a story for you, and I promise you, it's true.
When a Beast Looks Up at the Stars, by Oren Gray. Read by John Paget. What's the earliest memory you have of your father? My therapist is asking. Such a tired line. Something that a therapist would ask in a movie. I don't tell him the truth, of course. I cast around for an easy lie, the same one that I would give to Kenzie if she asked, though she never does. Tell him something about my dad wrapping Christmas presents in old shoe boxes, packing them in socks, a $20 bill stuck between two bricks wrapped in faded paper, something that could be cute but always felt mean-spirited. My laptop case is lying on the floor of the office. In it is a letter on stationery from the Selden Civics Committee or some such, a clipping from the Selden Herald, complete with a grainy newsprint photo of the old Gorka Theater, with its marquee like an Art Deco wave. I'm driving there from here in a rented black Accord, but I thought it would be a good idea to get one last therapy session in before I go. No. Let me stop. That's a lie, and I know it. Kenzie thought it would be a good idea, and she's right. But I knew it would be a waste of time, and it is. I talk about Selden, about my childhood, about my dad, but I skim over the surface, like I've taught myself to do, a rock skipping across a deep, black pond, never touching the water long enough to attract the attention of the beasts that circle below. I had written a book. Nothing actually very respectable. One of those 100 films to see before you shuffle off this filthy coil jobs. But it made it into the library journal, found its way onto B and N shelves, and something of that must have been enough to attract the attention of someone at the Selden Public Library. I learned from the letter and then the phone call that it was still in the same place it had always been, an old bank building, across the street from what used to be the drugstore, kept alive thanks to the efforts of the same civics committee that was on the letterhead. They were trying to save the Gorka Theater, and so were hosting a local film festival for charity. Obviously not big enough to draw any actual celebrities, They had reached out to me and asked me to host a few screenings, maybe even write a piece about it for the Herald. Local boy makes good, that sort of thing. So why did I say yes? Did I want out of the apartment, which seemed too claustrophobic now as I tried to navigate around the not-quite fight I seemed to be perpetually having with Kinsey, who, bless her, just wanted to help me, but I didn't want to be better just yet? Did I think it was finally time to confront Selden? Maybe drive by the house where I grew up, or that other house out on the long dirt roads that crisscrossed each other like grid lines of orange clay? Did I really care about saving the Gorka? I remembered it from my boyhood. I had watched Tremors there and the Tim Burton Batman. I remembered the big pickles that they sold out of a jar on the counter, the Mountain Dews full of crushed ice, a flavor that I still mentally associated with monster movies on the big screen, even though I hadn't had a Mountain Dew in probably 15 years. According to the voice of the lady on the phone, the one-screen theater was no longer privately owned, was instead kept limping along by the same civics committee that propped up the library, now dedicated to revival showings of The Wizard of Oz and the like. Did I think, as I told my therapist, as I intimated to Kinsey, that maybe I could get another book out of this experience? If I was a film writer, after all, then the Gorka was my ground zero, wasn't it? I had memories of my parents dropping me off, the truck idling in the grocery store parking lot across the street, as my mom pressed a few crumpled bills and pocket-warmed coins into my hand while my dad wasn't looking. The marquee was lit with neon pink, which spilled out onto the sidewalk around it. I remembered the strange tingly feeling I got when I saw older kids making out in the shadows of the alley next to the theater. I remembered the way that the guy behind the counter, Sam Gorka, I know now, but didn't know or care then, always knew my name, handing me my pickle or my Mountain Dew and smiling at me beneath his paper cap. There had to be a story here, right? About my going back to the place where I learned to love movies, to love that tingle of expectation that crackled through the theater like static electricity when the house lights went down. About the long walks home through the small town dark, hugging the middle of the side streets rather than the sidewalks, because the sidewalks were full of shadows that suddenly loomed up tall. About sitting next to Stormy Willis in those ratty theater seats, letting my knee brush against hers. About my own first kiss in that darkened alleyway, all hot and sudden and confusing. What had the Gorka been to me? A place to escape home that I remembered mostly as dark rooms and heavy silences, the furniture and the walls and the dark curtains all blending into a fungal melange of lichenous drabness in my memory. Only one thing clear, my father's voice, telling me how useless it all was. What was the line, the one that Walter Matthau gets in Hello, Dolly? You artists produce nothing that nobody needs. Never. My father would have agreed, even if he would have hated the movie if he ever saw it, as he had seemed to hate most things. That was the story that I had told myself, that this trip back to Selden would be good for me, good for my therapy, good for my non-existent career. I dutifully ignored the voice in my head that knew better, that knew that if I was able to write about myself and my feelings at all, then I wouldn't be writing about movies instead. They've graveled the roads since I was here last. I listen to the tires make that satisfying crunch as they roll over the new gravel because I've exhausted all of the downloaded episodes of Werewolf Ambulance and Pure Cinema podcast on my phone. I wasn't sure I would be able to find the house on my own, but here I am, rolling over the cattle guard and up to the place where the big gate used to hang. The sun is going down. It's turning the whole sky orange and red. The sun itself looks like a squashed tangerine, and all the light is the color of that scene at the end of Texas Chainsaw Massacre with Leatherface dancing in the middle of the road. The house isn't where I grew up. When I was a kid, it was my grandma's house. It had been my grandpa's farm once, but he died before I was born, and she hired young men from town to come take care of the cattle when it was time to sell them or brand them or do anything but milk and feed, which she handled herself until her dying day. I remember the house as a dark place, dim and faded, like an old sepia-toned photograph. The sun doesn't help now, shining through the slats of the house, through the broken-out windows, turning the whole place into a silhouette, a paper cutout of a Halloween-haunted house. My grandma died when I was in high school, and my parents moved out here for my last summer. I spent 3 months in one of the upstairs bedrooms before I went to college, with a view out that window right there that took in the then depopulated cattle pens like something from a photograph of the Holocaust. But it was never home to me. I park the car, shut off the engine. The fence is still there, but the gate is missing. I walk up to the house, where all the windows are broken out, the paint stripped off by the merciless Kansas wind, the insides filled with the broken wood and rat droppings. The house seems thin now, like a facade in a stage play or an old TV show. It seems like I could just reach out and push it over without much effort. Why did I come here rather than to the house where I spent most of my childhood, the house where now some other family lives? To my left are the cattle pens, and next to them the barn, which still seems solid and sturdy. Against the setting sun, it is a black block, a monolith. No light cuts through its walls or roof, but contrast also makes it impossible to pick out any details of the structure from this distance, and I don't walk any closer. Scared of it, as I always was when I was a kid, when it was still full of big, roiling walls of flesh, of animals with bland eyes that seemed to look through you, behind which I could detect no consciousness. My room is in the Stardust Motel, next to the Pizza Hut on the edge of town that was there even when I was a kid, and the Speedy Stop gas station up at the top of the hill. There's a Coke machine 3 doors down from my room that has ginger ale, and the bedspread is itchy, the shower missing its shower head, so that the water just comes out in a gush, like from a tap. The water is pleasantly hot at least, and the room only costs around $70 a night, so I don't complain to the scraggly-looking kid who sits behind his front desk, sporting a patchy beard and mustache that haven't yet completely grown in. The town is different than I remember. Already, when I was a kid, the tides of prosperity that once buoyed up places like this were beginning to recede. And in the 20 short years since I was here last, they have drifted so far afield that they can no longer be seen, even on a clear day. More buildings stand empty than not, and those that have fallen have been replaced with characterless trucks of manufactured sheet metal, when they have been replaced at all. Before checking into my room, I drove down Main Street, looked in the empty store fronts. There's a Dollar General store now that wasn't there before, and the lights from the grocery store were still on, though the place was closed for the night. I knew that the library wouldn't be open either, so I sat in the middle of the road on Osage Street and looked at the darkened marquees of the Gorka Theater, the dark alleyway next door, before I drove back to the motel and picked up my room keys. No cards here, still keys with those big plastic key rings that will ship the key back if you drop it in a mailbox somewhere. It reminds me of The Shining, but here the room numbers only go up to 23. I should call Kenzie, but instead I just text her. Let her know that I made it okay. Then I do my usual hotel routine of turning on every light in the place, even if, in this case, that consists of a yellow dome light populated by the bodies of a handful of dead bugs and a table lamp by the single queen bed. I take a scalding shower, then sit on the scratchy bedspread with my laptop open in front of me, pretending like I'm going to write up something worthwhile about my trip so far, until I finally just put in a DVD and fall asleep to the sounds of big atomic ants eating people out in the desert. The next day, I meet the librarian for breakfast at the Main Street Cafe, where she just drinks coffee into which she dumps creamer after creamer. I tell her I don't drink coffee and I order a Coke, even though if you asked me, I'd tell you that I don't drink soda anymore either. She looks like someone who got shrunk in the wash. Her wrists are skinny, her hair and glasses both too big for her face. She wears a floral print dress underneath what looks like the jacket from a navy-colored pantsuit. She could have been the librarian when I was a kid. I don't remember that librarian looking any different than this. She tells me how pleased she is that I was able to make it, how proud she is that someone from Selden is a famous writer. I don't bother to correct her. My eggs come out overcooked and rubbery on top of a pile of hash browns, so I chop up the whole concoction and dump some ketchup over it, wash it down with the forbidden taste of Coke. Around breakfast, I answered the librarian's effusive, if uninformed, praise by letting bland platitudes fall out of my mouth, as I have trained myself to do. I tell her about how some of my first exposure to film writing came from the old orange Crestwood House monster movie books that they used to have in the library here, about my early memories of the Gorka. She beams like she's supposed to, and I eat my food. It's Saturday, and the film festival is supposed to start this afternoon. To my surprise, they're showing Paper Moon instead of The Wizard of Oz, and then they're following that up with some made-for-TV type pioneer movie that I've never heard of that was apparently filmed nearby. We also found an 8mm film that was shot by a local filmmaker back in the 1970s, the librarian says, and the school had a projector that can play it, so we'll be ending the festival with that. We're so glad that you came back after all this time, she murmurs, pouring more creamer into her coffee, stirring and stirring it with a little metal spoon that clinks against the edge of the cup. Everyone comes home sooner or later. In the slaughterhouses, they used to kill cows with hammers, right? Until they replaced the hammers with those pressurized air guns like in No Country for Old Men. I saw my dad do it once. Kill a cow? No, not a cow. A calf. Kill it with a maul. Blood on blunt steel. My dad seemed huge then, leathery and creaking, like an automaton made of bone and sinew. That's the memory I never tell to my therapist, to Kenzie, just like I never tell them that I was afraid of him, always afraid. Not of what he would do to me, the fear never got that specific, but of what he was. Something alien, something I could never understand, never get inside, while he was already inside of me from before I could form memories. My own voice in my head speaking his words like a wooden puppet on the lap of a ventriloquist, telling me how useless everything was, what a waste of time was everything into which I ever poured my energy. In the end, he was the one who looked like a puppet, reduced and shrunken, hooked up to the marionette wires of the hospital machines, nothing like the leathery golem of my childhood memories, blood dripping from the hammer in his hands, the mindless squeal of that dying calf echoing in my ears as I crouched in the darkness of the barn, the smell of blood and brains and hide filling the air. By then, the time to confront him was already past. My mother had died years before, and he and I had stood silently on either side of the casket, nothing more to say to one another, not even then. At the end, there was nothing left in that withered husk, nothing that burned out from behind those dark eyes. If I was going to stand up for myself, I had already missed my chance. So I just stood there silently once again, my eyes on the floor while he stared at me, his eyes cold and hard and mindless, like the cows in their pens. I walked away without saying anything. He died sometime in the night, and I didn't drive back for the funeral. Between Paper Moon and the other movie, Frontier Song or whatever it's called, I walked out onto the street for some fresh air. The sun is sinking behind the grocery store, and someone has turned on the Gorka's marquee. Pink light paints the sidewalk under my feet, and I look up at the sign to see that about half of it is burnt out. Past it, I can see the stars just beginning to pepper the darkening sky. The inside of the theater looks almost exactly how I remember it. The ticket booth and the concession stand in the same place, the carpet still threadbare. The old movie poster frames have been taken down and replaced with painted reproductions of the posters for a couple of classic films, while the walls have been repainted and are already starting to peel again. The chairs inside the theater are just as they always were, hard and narrow, smelling faintly like a thrift store. But I've got a couple of them roped off just for me. Next to the librarian, and a man who looks like a pastor and says that he's from the civics committee when he shakes my hand. Normally, I would never agree to host something like this without getting to see the films first, but there's not much that's required of me here. Most of the seats are empty, and those that are filled are all clearly occupied by locals. The majority are people who look like they just came in from church, old and flabby and attempting to look prosperous in suits that they obviously wear only for special occasions, while a few are local teenagers who are unlikely to appreciate anything that's on the day's docket. Before Paper Moon, the librarian got up in front of the crowd, such as it is, and introduced me, talked about my books as though it was a New York Times bestseller, and then I walked up in front to a scattering of compulsory applause. I talked a little bit about movies, about growing up in Selden and coming to the Gorka, and then I sat back down and the projector sputtered to life, and that was it. Before I left the hotel, I popped a pill from the case that I keep in my pocket at all times. And now, standing out in the growing dark in front of the theater, I chase it with another one, dry swallowing. The concession stand inside is open, staffed by a kid with greasy hair under the same kind of paper hat that Sam Gorka used to wear, and I decided to go in and see if they have any Mountain Dew, if they still have crushed ice. Inside the lobby, the librarian is talking to the guy from the civics committee. When they see me come in, they both smile big, beaming smiles at me. I smile back, like I've trained myself to do. I learned a long time ago that animals that behave themselves don't draw unwanted attention. The pills make me drowsy, and during Frontier Song, I mostly doze off so that I'm half surprised when the credits are rolling and the house lights are coming back up. The librarian shuffles to the front of the house and leads a round of undeserved applause for the movie that just finished screening. "While our volunteers get us set up for our third and final film," she says, "I want to say a few words about this theater and the movie that you're about to see. As most of you probably know, this theater was started by Samuel Gorka way back in 1953, and it stayed in his family for 2 generations. What we're about to watch is a short film that Samuel shot right here in Selden back in the 1970s, using all local cast and crew." This time the applause is a little more heartfelt. Samuel Gorka had been the father of the Sam Gorka I knew. I remembered seeing him from time to time, a wizened man by the time I was a kid, who occasionally haunted the theater like a ghost, mostly spending his time in the projection booth. A memory hit me then, sudden and hard, one that I had set aside and lost over the years, of Sam saying to me, "Dad treats those projectors like his babies. Nobody else knows how to run 'em like he does." I look up at the window of the projection booth but can't see anything behind it from this angle. My imagination conjures up an image of Samuel Gorka, little more than a mummified corpse by this time, shriveled up like those shrunken apple heads that Vincent Price used to peddle in the backs of comic books, still running the projectors that no one else knows how to operate. Before I can chase the weird fantasy too far, however, the librarian is sitting back down in the chair next to me, the house lights are going down, and the projector is sputtering to life once more. The film is dark, which means that the house is kept dark, so that everything around me is murky and lost, save for the occasional glint of the librarian's glasses. My fingertips are resting on the cold, sweating surface of my Mountain Dew, the wax paper damp under my touch. The footage is amateur, handheld, like a home video, something that I would expect to see in a modern found footage horror movie. The setting is dark, lit by the flickering orange glow of long torches stuck into the ground of a fire that's somewhere off camera. The cameraman is approaching a structure that I recognize, even past the darkness and the grain of the film. The door of the barn on my grandma's property is like the mouth of a cave. In the background are the cattle pens, newer than I have ever seen them looking, and within them dark shapes that are not cows shift and jostle. There are people gathered around, lined up on either side of the dirt path, which leads up to the barn door like they are watching a parade. It takes me a moment to realize that they are naked, their skin decorated with crude daubs of paint or mud. The people in the crowd are a mix of genders and ages. Here, sagging bellies hang over flaccid genitalia. There, taut, firm breasts are decorated with circles around the nipples. One man strokes an erection, but the camera doesn't linger on the crowd. From out of the barn door steps a minotaur, a sledgehammer cradled in its hands. No, not a minotaur, because the head isn't that of a bull. The figure is just a man, isn't it? In a rubber goat's head mask and yak fur leggings? Like Satan on his rock and Hammer's The Devil Rides Out. But that doesn't look like a mask, even in the grainy 8mm footage. It looks like an actual goat's head, hollowed out for a man to stuff his own head inside. Yes, there's even something, black stuff that must be blood, dripping down from the stump of the neck, staining the man's torso in little smeared rivers, and all I can think of is that he must be choking on the stuff inside there, his mouth and nose and eyes full of gore and filth. How could he stand it, even for the short duration that the camera will stay on him? But the camera does stay on him, doesn't flinch away, as it would in a studio film to preserve the illusion, that glimpse of something wrong that stays stuck in your brain because you can't fully process it, and so you fill it in, build it up. No. Here it stays and stays, staring, transfixed. It draws closer, not a zoom. The cameraman actually approaching with shaky steps, closer and closer to that bloody goat's head mounted atop that leathery, familiar body. Up close, it's clear that the goat's head is real. There's nothing else it could be, and yet, how did they get the eyes to do that? To glow like that, yellow like that, with life behind them? Those slitted sideways pupils slightly narrowed in the middle, like hourglasses turned on their sides, the yellow around them glowing like a Tiffany lamp. The cameraman is kneeling in the dirt now, looking up at the figure towering above him. I'm 6 years old, crouched in the dark, watching my father bring the maul down on the head of the calf, watching how its eyes change when it dies, hearing that squeal that has never left my brain, the stench that I sometimes still think I can smell in my clothes. The goat man raises the hammer up above his head, and the film doesn't flinch as the blow falls. I think that the camera is lying in the dirt now, still filming, but I can't be certain because the film is starting to run in front of me, to wobble and distort. I can feel the beads of sweat on the cup against my fingertips, and I try to stand up, but the theater seems to spin. The librarian is asking me something, and there is laughter in her voice as I crumble against the seat backs in front of me, pitch forward and crumble into the darkness between the theater seats, then into a deeper darkness yet. I wake up on my knees with the bag over my head. Under my jeans, I can feel the dirt, and I smell the rank stench of old hay and animals. Through the bag, I can see the flicker of flames, and I know where I am even before they pull the covering off. I'm kneeling in front of the door of my grandma's barn, and all around me are the people from the theater. They're dressed for an older kind of church now, their clothes shed, their naked bodies daubed with what I now know is not paint, but blood mixed with earth. I wish that I was thinking of Kenzie, regretting the distance that I have always kept between us, but mostly I'm thinking of myself, of the stench of that dying calf, and other memories that I thought time and distance and ritual had scrubbed away. The stone has stayed too long on the surface of the pond, and now those circling creatures below have started to rise. The figure steps out of the darkness, and I know it immediately, even as I know that it is impossible. The severed goat head drips black blood down across that familiar chest, and the hammer rests in those familiar hands. Its steps are mechanical, like a puppet being pulled forward by invisible cables, like the figures in one of those mechanized dioramas in a penny arcade. It steps forward, 1 foot, then the next. The hammer rises in its hands, a spring being wound tighter and tighter. I look up at the stars that seem like they're being blotted out by the goat man's shadow, and wait for the blow to fall.
They're real podcasts, by the way. I checked. The links are in the show notes, and I subscribe now. I'll report back. Well, this one hits me where I lived, and as a friend of mine likes to suggest, must one day return so they can murder me and choose a new king, ensuring the crops will continue to be bountiful. The cinema as cultural hub and departure lounge is something this small town, small island boy knows entirely too well. There were 3 whole screens on the island, all over half an hour away, by car, 2 located in a dilapidated hotel that had seen better days, but still somehow had a magnificent 1,500-seat theatre, one that was packed for Star Trek and Batman movies without fail. The other was a tiny screen buried deep inside the Summerland Leisure Complex. Yes, it was exactly as sinister as the name suggests, under a massive hall full of international flags. The last movie I saw as a Manx resident was there. Die Hard with a Vengeance. They sold ice cream in the intermission that I remember brilliantly fell halfway through the elevator scene. Outline though, everyone comes home sooner or later. The last movie I went to see with my best friend was The Crow. Neither of us were old enough, and neither us or our folks cared. The following day he had blood tests to see if his leukemia had returned for a 3rd time. It had, and he would die later that year. That was roughly 25 years ago. It took me a long time to watch The Crow again. I like to think I've never gone back to that theatre since moving away as well. That's certainly the good story, isn't it? The neat one. But the truth is rarely either, and that for me is where the beauty and the horror of this story lies. In its untidiness, in its denial of catharsis, in the answers that we get, and the lack of explanation for why we get them. Just enough visible out there in the darkness, just enough to keep us worried, just enough to keep us watching. Between the celluloid flutter on the screen and the seats that were somehow always too warm, that's where this story lives. That darkness, that liminal space I go to when I need to heal my hurt, to turn the back of my head off for a few hours. Like I say, for me that's a safe space. For this story, here be dragons. And what dragons they are. The horrors of a small town where everyone knows your name. The implication that this has all been planned for a long, long time. The deeper implication that the abuse the lead suffered was a coping mechanism for his father's knowledge of what was to come. Generations of people coping, but never more than that, out in the dark, waiting for the goat man to return. And then, well, every film is a story, and every story needs its final act. What an extraordinary story from an extraordinary pair of talents. Thank you both. We rely on you to pay our authors, cover our server costs, all of that stuff. And this year those costs have gone up. The SFWA have raised the qualifying rate to 8 cents a word, and that's not remotely a bad thing. Honestly, it's probably a little low and certainly long overdue, and we've raised to meet them. Our income hasn't, quite, and we've struggled with the valiant efforts of our staff all the way through the year to get us most of the way there. The simple truth is this: to pay these people what they deserve, we need $1,000 more a month, if not slightly more. And we don't quite have that yet, and we're doing it anyway. Not just that, but we're also looking to pay our slush readers once we get to that point, because slush readers are the first point of contact between every author and every magazine, and they deserve to be paid for the work they do. The unsung hero doesn't even come into it. So we need your help, and if you can spare it, we need your money. There are 2 places you can hand some of that over. The first is you can donate through PseudoPod.org, clicking on Feed the Pod, and if you subscribe for as little as $5 a month over there, you'll get access to a massive vault of exclusive audio. You can do the same thing at Patreon for $5 a month, and there are higher levels which get you behind-the-scenes access and all kinds of good stuff. We appreciate, especially this time of year, that perhaps not everybody has the disposable income to do this kind of thing. If you don't have that, could we perhaps ask for some time? Tweet a link to a story you really liked, put it on Instagram or Tumblr or any social network. If you want us to come on your show or your blog, we love being interviewed, we love chatting about this stuff. Please ask. I promise we'll sort something out. Alternatively, please leave a review at either Apple Podcasts or Google or wherever you find our shows. It all helps. It all helps raise our profile. And for that, like in all things, we need you. So thank you for all the work you do. Believe me, without you, there would be no us.
Do you find most perfumes reek of banality and bad French puns? Do you want perfume that speaks to you, the discerning PseudoPod listener? Allow me to introduce you to the fine perfumers of Black Phoenix Alchemy Lab. You can experience scents based on titans of literature like William Shakespeare, Lewis Carroll, and H.P. Lovecraft, to modern storytellers like Clive Barker, Kelly Sue DeConnick, and Neil Gaiman. Their perfume oils are lovingly hand-blended using only the finest ingredients. All this and more can be found at blackphoenixalchemylab.com. So go ahead, indulge yourself.
PseudoPod will return next week when, as now, it will be a production of Escape Artists Incorporated and released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Next week's story is The Boy Who Killed His Mother by Rosemary Hayes, and I will leave you with this quote. Well, that's a quote, more a question. Do you read Sutter Kane?
It's a pseudopod. It's a big foot.
It's all about podcasts these days.